The real estate closing should have been routine, but the attorney's hands trembled as she recognized the buyer's name. Patricia Thornton was purchasing 4247 Willowbrook Lane, a modest two-story colonial in suburban Detroit, for exactly $485,000 cash. The seller, elderly Margaret Thornton, sat across the mahogany table, unaware she was signing away her home to her former daughter-in-law, the woman who destroyed her son financially just 8 months earlier. Patricia's revenge had been methodical, patient, and devastatingly complete. She'd taken Michael's entire divorce settlement, every penny of his father's inheritance, and now she was taking the one thing he'd promised his dying father he'd protect: his mother's home. Chapter 1. The marriage built on calculated lies. Michael Thornton had inherited his cautious nature from his accountant father, a man who'd kept meticulous records of every penny spent since 1982. That same careful attention to detail had served Michael well in his career as a financial advisor at Morrison Wealth Management in downtown Detroit, where he managed portfolios for the city's quietly wealthy families. At 38, he'd built a reputation for conservative investments and honest advice, traits that earned him loyal clients and steady six-figure commissions. His life followed a predictable rhythm of early morning client calls, afternoon portfolio reviews, and evening visits to his widowed mother's house, where he'd help with yard work and share dinner at the same kitchen table where he'd done homework as a child. Patricia Chun entered his orderly world like a carefully orchestrated symphony. They met at a charity auction for the Detroit Institute of Arts in September 2018, where she'd outbid him on a 19th-century maritime painting with a smile that suggested she enjoyed the competition more than the artwork. Elegant in a midnight blue cocktail dress, she moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her laughter drawing attention without seeming to seek it. She told him she worked in medical device sales, traveled frequently to conferences, and had recently relocated from Chicago to expand her territory into Michigan. Their courtship unfolded with surprising intensity. Patricia possessed an uncanny ability to appear whenever Michael felt most alone, arriving with homemade soup when he worked late, suggesting weekend trips to Traverse City when stress lined his face, listening with genuine interest as he explained market volatility over wine. She never pushed for commitment, never mentioned marriage, which paradoxically made Michael pursue her more earnestly. Within 6 months, he'd proposed at the same charity gala where they'd met, presenting a 2-carat diamond that cost 3 months of his salary. The wedding in June 2019 was modest by Patricia's standards but extravagant by Michael's, held at the Grosse Pointe Yacht Club with 150 guests. Patricia's side of the aisle remained conspicuously sparse, explained away by her claim of a small family scattered across the country. Michael's mother, Margaret, watched from the front row with an expression that photographers mistook for emotional joy but was actually deep uncertainty. Something about Patricia's perfectly timed tears during the vows, the way her voice caught at precisely the right moment, stirred an unease in Margaret that she'd tried unsuccessfully to communicate to her son. After the honeymoon in Santorini, the newlyweds settled into Michael's Colonial Heights townhouse, and Patricia began what she would later call her integration phase. She volunteered to handle their joint finances, citing her business degree from Northwestern and arguing that Michael worked too many hours to manage both client portfolios and household accounts. She passworded their joint accounts for security, enrolled in online banking that only she monitored, and gradually shifted Michael's direct deposits into accounts she controlled. Her explanations were always reasonable, delivered with the same warm concern that had first attracted him. The transformation happened so gradually that Michael barely noticed. Patricia suggested they needed better insurance, more sophisticated estate planning, updated investment strategies that required liquidating his conservative holdings for opportunities she'd researched. When Michael's father passed away suddenly in March 2020, leaving his son $485,000, Patricia took charge of managing the grief-stricken family's immediate needs. She arranged the funeral, coordinated with attorneys, and comforted Margaret with a daughter-in-law's devotion that seemed genuine to everyone watching. Behind that compassionate facade, She was already calculating how to redirect the inheritance into accounts Michael would never think to examine, preparing for an exit strategy that would leave him financially and emotionally devastated while she emerged wealthy and vindicated. Chapter 2. The Systematic Destruction. By January 2021, Patricia Thornton had transformed from devoted wife into a methodical architect of financial ruin, though Michael remained blissfully unaware of the demolition happening beneath his feet. The pandemic had provided perfect cover for her activities, as remote work and social isolation meant fewer witnesses to their relationship's carefully managed decay. She'd convinced Michael that market volatility required frequent portfolio adjustments, producing convincing spreadsheets that showed their investments thriving when they were actually hemorrhaging into offshore accounts she'd established through a web of shell companies. The first significant withdrawal happened on a Tuesday morning while Michael attended virtual client meetings in his home office. Patricia transferred $75,000 from their joint investment account into what appeared to be a high-yield municipal bond fund. The documentation she'd created was flawless, complete with prospectuses and quarterly statements bearing logos of legitimate financial institutions. She'd learned during her 2 previous marriages that the key to successful financial manipulation wasn't hiding the money movement, but disguising it as responsible financial planning. Margaret Thornton noticed the changes before her son did. During Sunday dinners, she observed how Patricia would steer conversations away from finances, how she developed sudden headaches whenever Michael suggested reviewing their accounts together, how her designer handbags multiplied while she complained about their budget. When Margaret gently questioned a $40,000 charge on a credit card statement she'd accidentally seen, Patricia explained it away as a business investment opportunity that required immediate capital, promising returns that would fund their future children's college educations. The marriage's foundation cracked visibly in March when Michael discovered Patricia had been telling elaborate lies about her background. A chance encounter with someone claiming to be her former colleague revealed that Patricia had never worked in medical device sales. Her Northwestern degree was fabricated, her Chicago apartment never existed, and the wealthy family she described had no record of her existence. When confronted, Patricia transformed from wounded victim to calculated predator within seconds, filing for divorce the next morning with an attorney she'd retained 6 months earlier. The legal assault was breathtaking in its precision. Patricia claimed emotional abuse, financial control, and irreconcilable differences that painted Michael as a tyrant who'd forced her to abandon her career. She documented every argument with recordings taken out of context, photographed herself with makeup-created bruises, and created a paper trail suggesting Michael had hidden assets from her. The preliminary hearing went disastrously for Michael, whose shock at the accusations made him appear guilty rather than genuinely bewildered. While Michael scrambled to mount a defense, Patricia accelerated her financial extraction. She'd gained power of attorney during his father's funeral preparations, a document Michael had signed without reading, trusting his wife to handle details while he grieved. Using this authority, she liquidated his retirement accounts, paying massive early withdrawal penalties that she'd calculated were worth the immediate access to cash. She sold his stocks at losses, transferred bonds to accounts in her maiden name, and even borrowed against his life insurance policy. The divorce proceedings stretched through summer, each hearing draining more of Michael's resources as Patricia's attorney demanded extensive discovery, depositions, and forensic accounting that ironically never revealed her hidden transfers. Margaret watched her son age years and months, his confidence shattered by Patricia's constant gaslighting and legal maneuvering. The woman who'd once brought soup to his office now claimed he'd been verbally abusive, that his visits to his mother were attempts to hide money, that his conservative investment strategy was designed to keep her financially dependent. By August, Michael's attorney advised settling rather than continuing a battle that would consume whatever resources remained. Patricia's final demand was $500,000, essentially every penny of his inheritance plus his remaining savings. The alternative was continued litigation that would cost even more, with no guarantee of a better outcome. Michael signed the agreement with hands that shook from exhaustion rather than rage, unaware that Patricia had one final act of cruelty planned. Chapter 3. The Ultimate Revenge Purchase. Margaret Thornton had lived at 4247 Willowbrook Lane for 32 years, raising her family in a modest colonial that represented every sacrifice she and her late husband had made. The house wasn't grand, with its dated kitchen and creaking floorboards, but it held memories in every corner. Pencil marks on the doorframe tracking Michael's growth, the basement workshop where her husband had taught their son woodworking, the garden where she'd planted roses for each grandchild she'd hoped to have. At 73, she'd never imagined leaving, especially not under circumstances that would destroy what remained of her family's foundation. The financial pressure began subtly in September 2021, just weeks after Michael's divorce was finalized. Margaret's property taxes arrived with an error, or so she thought, showing an amount 3 times higher than previous years. The city assessor's office explained that recent neighborhood development had drastically increased property values, making her taxes unaffordable on her fixed income. Then came the letter from her insurance company, canceling her homeowner's policy due to an anonymous report of structural damage that would require extensive repairs. The repair estimates from contractors who appeared unbidden at her door ranged from $80,000 to $100,000, money she simply didn't have. Patricia orchestrated each crisis with surgical precision from her new luxury apartment in Birmingham, using connections she'd cultivated during her marriage to Michael. The property assessor owed her a favor after she'd helped his daughter secure a prestigious internship. The insurance adjuster had been surprisingly receptive to her concerns about the property's condition after she'd provided documentation suggesting potential liabilities. The contractors were legitimate businesses who'd received anonymous tips about a desperate elderly woman who might pay premium prices for urgent repairs. Each pressure point was legal, defensible, and devastating in its cumulative effect. Michael tried desperately to help his mother, but Patricia had left him financially crippled. His credit was destroyed from the divorce proceedings, his savings depleted, his ability to secure loans non-existent. He worked 18-hour days trying to rebuild his client base, many of whom had fled during the public spectacle of his divorce. The stress manifested physically, landing him in the emergency room with chest pains that turned out to be anxiety attacks, adding medical bills to his mounting obligations. He sold his car, moved into a studio apartment, and ate one meal a day, saving every penny for his mother's property taxes. By November, Margaret faced an impossible choice. She could lose the house to tax foreclosure, destroying her credit and leaving her homeless, or she could sell quickly to the cash buyer who made an unsolicited offer through a third-party real estate company. The offer was generous, $485,000, enough to pay her debts and secure a small apartment where she could live modestly. The buyer requested a quick closing, willing to handle all repairs, paying cash with no contingencies. Margaret never knew that the shell company making the offer traced back through 3 layers of legal entities to Patricia Thornton. The closing was scheduled for December 15th at Press and Title Company, a date Patricia had chosen specifically because Michael would be in Chicago that day, desperately pitching to potential clients in a last-ditch effort to save his career. Patricia arrived early, wearing a conservative suit that bore no resemblance to the designer outfit she'd favored during her marriage. She'd even changed her perfume, knowing that scent might trigger Margaret's recognition. Her attorney handled most of the communication while Patricia sat quietly, signing documents with practiced efficiency. Margaret's hands trembled as she signed away decades of memories, each signature feeling like a betrayal of her late husband's legacy. She'd told Michael the house was being sold, but hadn't revealed the timing, knowing he'd abandoned his crucial Chicago meetings to stop her. The closing attorney, unaware of the connection between seller and buyer, commented on what a smooth transaction it was, how rare to see such straightforward terms. Patricia remained silent, her expression neutral, savoring the moment she'd planned for months. The revelation came 3 weeks later when Patricia posted photos on social media. Images of her redecorating Margaret's former home with expensive furnishings. She kept Margaret's garden but installed a fountain where her husband's workshop had stood. The kitchen Michael had promised to renovate for his mother now gleamed with commercial-grade appliances. The doorframe with the pencil marks had been painted over in pristine white. Each change was calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage, transforming a sanctuary into a monument to Patricia's vengeance. Chapter 4. When Revenge Becomes Criminal. The anonymous tip arrived at the Michigan Attorney General's office on January 10, 2022, containing documentation so detailed that prosecutor Sarah Matthews initially suspected it came from someone within Patricia's inner circle. Bank statements, forged signatures, falsified financial documents, and a complex web of shell companies were laid out with prosecutorial precision. What Matthews didn't know was that the source was Patricia's previous victim, a man named David Chun from Chicago who'd spent 3 years gathering evidence after Patricia had destroyed his family's importing business through similar tactics. David Chun had tracked Patricia through 5 name changes in 3 states, building a comprehensive file on her patterns of financial predation. He discovered at least 4 previous victims, all men who'd lost substantial inheritances or family assets to Patricia's schemes. Each case followed the same blueprint: rapid courtship, strategic marriage, systematic financial extraction, and devastating divorce proceedings. The purchase of Margaret Thornton's house had been Patricia's first mistake in years, a deviation from her usual pattern of disappearing after securing her victim's assets. Her need for this specific act of cruelty had finally made her traceable. Detective James Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Division arrived at 4247 Willowbrook Lane on a gray February morning, warrant in hand and forensic accountants in tow. Patricia answered the door wearing Margaret's old apron, a detail that would later strike investigators as particularly callous. Her composure cracked only slightly when Rodriguez mentioned they'd frozen all her accounts that morning, including the offshore holdings she believed untraceable. The search revealed meticulous records Patricia had kept as trophies, including Margaret's family photo albums she'd taken from the house, annotated with mocking comments about Michael's childhood pictures. The investigation uncovered crimes spanning far beyond the Thornton family. Patricia had committed identity theft, wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering across state lines, elevating her crimes to federal offenses. The forged power of attorney documents alone carried potential sentences of 20 years. Her fabricated abuse allegations against Michael constituted perjury and fraud upon the court. The manipulation of Margaret's property assessments involved bribing public officials, adding corruption charges to her growing indictment. Each crime had been committed with such attention to detail that prosecutors realized they were dealing with someone who'd made destroying lives into an art form. Michael learned about Patricia's arrest while sitting in his mother's cramped apartment, sharing a dinner of pasta and canned sauce that reminded him painfully of better times. The FBI agent who called him spoke carefully, explaining that asset recovery was possible but would take time. Michael's hands shook as he processed the information, not from anger, but from a relief so profound it felt like physical collapse. His mother held him as he cried for the first time since the divorce, years of suppressed emotion flooding out in the safety of her presence. The trial began in September 2022, drawing media attention as details of Patricia's crimes emerged. She'd stolen over $3 million across her various schemes, destroying families from Michigan to Florida. Her defense attorney attempted to paint her as a woman driven to crime by childhood trauma, but the jury saw through the performance. Patricia's expression during victim impact statements revealed her true nature, a cold satisfaction even as Margaret Thornton described losing her home. The prosecution presented evidence that Patricia had been planning to sell Margaret's house to developers for triple what she'd paid, adding insult to profound injury. Margaret testified on the trial's 3rd day, her dignity intact despite Patricia's attempts to break her spirit. She described not just the loss of property, but the destruction of her family's emotional foundation. How Michael had attempted suicide 2 months after learning about the house sale. How she'd found him unconscious in his apartment with bottles of pills he'd stockpiled. Her testimony stripped away any remaining sympathy for Patricia, revealing the human cost of financial crimes that might otherwise seem merely numerical. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 17 counts. Patricia received a sentence of 35 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 20. The judge ordered full restitution to all victims, though investigators acknowledged that much of the money had been spent on Patricia's lavish lifestyle. Margaret's house was returned through civil asset forfeiture, though she and Michael would need years to restore it from Patricia's renovations. Michael rebuilt his life slowly, his reputation gradually recovering as news of Patricia's crimes spread through Detroit's financial community. Clients who'd abandoned him returned with apologies and referrals. He moved back into his childhood home with his mother. Their roles reversed as he cared for her while she healed from the trauma. The pencil marks on the doorframe were gone, but they created new traditions, planting a memorial garden for his father where Patricia's fountain had stood. Patricia Thornton had orchestrated the perfect revenge, taking everything from Michael, including his mother's home. But her need to witness the destruction, to own the very walls that held his memories, became the evidence that finally brought justice. Sometimes the cruelest revenge becomes its own undoing. Patricia Thornton spent years perfecting the art of financial revenge, destroying lives with calculated precision and taking everything from her victims. But in the end, her twisted need to own Michael's pain, to live inside his mother's memories, became the very evidence that sent her to prison. She took his $500,000 settlement and bought his mother's house, but all she really purchased was a 35-year prison sentence.